boy, Mochi. Good boy. Good boy, Mochi. Good morning, everybody. All right, well, couple of things just to start off for today. You took a test on Monday. I will be grading those later today-ish, possibly tomorrow. But I'll try and get those in the grade book as soon as possible. On Monday, I did a huge grade update, so aside from the test, everything should be pretty well up to date. As far as the practice DBQ, I understand that some of you struggled with it. Don't panic about that. In particular, Teddy, I got your email. Don't worry. Just, hopefully you did the best that you could. It's not part of your test grade, okay? So don't panic about that. Grading writing takes me some time, but I will be going through and providing some feedback on those essays to help you, fix any mistakes that you can fix to start scoring better on them and stuff like that. So it'll just count as like a regular everyday assignment. It's not going to be a make or break your grade sort of a thing. Should be pretty innocuous, so don't worry too much about that. We're just trying to get as much practice as we can on the DBQs. So that's why I wanted you to do one, but I didn't want you to feel like panicking because it was going to be part of your test score or anything like that. The tests will be their own thing, and then the DBQ will just be a regular assignment this time. But as I said, it'll take me some time to get through those, so just kind of sit tight on that for now, because grading writing is very slow. And then also for today, I've already put on Canvas the first, I think, 12 questions for the Chapter 20 reading guide. So that will be the assignment for Friday. And today we are starting our brand new unit of the Industrial Revolution. And there's a whole lot to talk about. So without further ado, I am going to jump over to the desktop now and get started lecturing on that. I'm going to try and really be cruising through this unit here to kind of make up some time. So, aside from a certain day where there's a really, really good BBC documentary on industrialization in Britain that I'm going to be showing you probably early next week. Probably Monday of next week would be my guess when I show that one. So that'll probably be your assignment for Monday, is to watch the documentary. I've got an assignment that's going to go along with that. And so aside from that day, pretty much we're just going to be turning and burning through material here and try and catch up some time here so that we can finish everything that we need to by I don't know when the test will be for this class. Hopefully you can finish it in about 2 weeks, okay? Hopefully you can finish it about 2 weeks. We'll see what happens. I'll let you know when the end of the unit will be as we get closer to it. But for right now, we're just getting started. So let's go ahead and jump over to the PowerPoint that I have for you, which, by the way, is available to you also on Canvas. So if you want to follow along on the PowerPoint, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, it'll be displayed on the screen here as we go through. So here we go. The Industrial Revolution. And the first thing that we're going to be talking about today with respect to the Industrial Revolution is, of course, that it happens in the 1800s. Now, the way that we oftentimes characterize this period of time in British history is we call it Victorian Britain. Victorian Britain. And the way that we get that phrase Victorian Britain is because of Queen Victoria, who happened to be the monarch of England for a very long time. In fact, she was the longest reigning queen that England had had, the longest reigning monarch that England had had, going back to Elizabeth I, who was the last daughter and last member of the Tudor dynasty to rule England. You might remember learning about Elizabeth I back in the late 1500s. Queen Victoria is queen from 1837, okay, until 1901. I want you to think about that time span. 1837 until 1901, okay? That is a truly very, very long time. 63 years she served as queen. And so because she basically served for the entirety of the 19th century, we frequently refer to this period of time as the Victorian Age. That's where we get that phrase from. Now, recently, she is no longer the longest serving queen of England because her record has already been broken by the current Queen of England, Elizabeth II, okay, who is still queen to this day. As you know, she's well into her 90s. She has, reigned as Queen of England going back to, gosh, the early 50s, I think. Really long time. And so Queen Victoria is one of these really long-lasting queens, and really very much comes to be the embodiment of kind of this generation or several generations of British history. But anyhow, talking about the Industrial Revolution, kind of just a broad theme to get us started here. The Industrial Revolution is debatably the most important human development in human history of the last 10,000 years. It radically altered the European economy, but also just in the entire global economy over time by providing steam power for factory production and for transportation developments, because remember, they started putting steam engines on trains and on boats and things, as well as the textile, coal, and iron industries, each being the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution. Now, one of the things that I do need to mention to you to start us off today is to make clear that actually, as we've moved throughout time, that historians have increasingly begun to, rather than just characterize it as like one single industrial revolution. To be honest, the changes that we are seeing happen during the Industrial Revolution are more often these days broken down into multiple revolutions. So that is to say that there is a first industrial revolution, there is a second industrial revolution. Some people say there is even a third and a fourth industrial revolution, including the most recent revolution of the revolution of technology, which once again has completely changed the economy globally. Okay, so just beware that in the last 200 years, we can really actually point to multiple industrial revolutions. Just to be clear though with you, for the purposes of this unit, we're really just going to be focusing on the first industrial revolution. We will, however, down the line, when we get to a new unit later on, talk a little bit about how the second industrial revolution was different from the first one. To give you a little bit of a preview on that, let me just, we usually describe these two or differentiate these two based on the kinds of products that were being produced. So, when we think the first industrial revolution is going to be comprised of things such as textiles, okay? Particularly in the beginning, wool textiles, but increasingly afterwards, cotton textiles, which we'll talk about in a bit here. So textiles big. Coal was a big part of it. They started to use coal for fuel. Now, previous to the Industrial Revolution, the number one thing used as fuel by pretty much everyone across Europe, but also in England, was wood. But trees take a long time to grow, right? And pretty much there's not a single tree left standing in England by the time that we get to right around the Agricultural Revolution, okay? Pretty much every single last tree in England has been chopped down, either for fuel or to build stuff, and in particularly to build ships, okay? You know, the British had a bunch of ships. The ships were made of wood. You know, what can I tell you? They chopped down all the trees. They needed a new fuel source. Now, where they turned to is coal, okay? Coal, though, is although it's a better fuel source than wood in many respects, because wood burns relatively quickly, coal burns relatively slowly. So, so that's nice, okay? But coal does come with it a number of other complications. Namely, you have to mine coal. And coal, because it's mined from the ground, from underground, what would happen is, even though England had these vast deposits of coal, for a long time it was really difficult for them to extract that coal out of the ground, because the climate of England is particularly rainy. And whenever you dig holes into the ground, they're going to fill up with water. And England being marshy and swampy anyway in a lot of different places made it so that mining coal was a really difficult and also really dangerous job. You know, when you start digging into the ground, you can hit deposits of natural gas. You can strike a piece of flint and have the whole place explode. They're, as the British would put it, absolutely deadly. These places were like giant death traps, right? You would not want to find yourself at the bottom of a coal mine where, you know, that there was all this gas and other ghastly things down there. Anyway, so the coal mines were very, very dangerous, but increasingly they begin to, it's kind of an unusual phenomenon that happens, because on one hand, they struggle to mine coal, which is precisely what they're trying to use to power these new steam engines that they've developed, okay? So why did they develop steam engines? Believe it or not, it was to mine coal, because originally the reason that steam engines were produced were as pumps. They would use steam engines to pump water out of coal mines. And so, you know, they built these steam engine pumps that allowed them to pump this water out of the coal mine so that they would continue to be able to mine more coal, which would then power more steam engines, which powered things like trains and boats and factories and other things like that. And the whole thing just kind of feeds itself in this positive interference loop, which we'll talk about in another class. Another factor of the the first industrial revolution, is iron. England also happened to have vast deposits of iron ore, which helped them to create, you know, use the iron for building materials to create factories, to create trains, to create steam engines, to create all sorts of different kinds of things. And so these are some of the products that we typically associate with the first industrial revolution. So steam engines, coal, iron, trains, textiles, things like that. As a you know, what's the word, that a preview, okay, as a preview to what's coming down the line, by the time that we get to about the 1870s, 1880s, we see the second industrial revolution come about. And as I said, that's not the focus of this unit, but I'm just giving you a little bit of a preview here. If we were talking about products of the second industrial revolution, we're not going to be talking so much about things like textile, coal, or iron. Instead, we're going to be looking at different things. Instead of using coal, increasingly as we get into the second industrial revolution, they're using petroleum, fossil fuels, gasoline, things like this, okay? Instead of iron. In the second industrial revolution, we're focused much more on things like steel, okay? Whereas in the first industrial revolution, we were focused on steam engines and trains. In the second industrial revolution, the focus becomes much more about internal combustion engines and cars, okay? Automobiles. Instead of textiles in the first industrial revolution. In the second industrial revolution, we're focusing less on textiles and more on other kinds of goods. This could include chemicals, pharmaceuticals, dyes. It also could include consumer goods, things like furniture, lamps, clocks, things like that, okay? Stuff that people buy and use in their own homes. And then too, of course, in the second industrial revolution, we see a heavy focus on the development of military weapons, okay? So there's, in the second industrial revolution, thanks to burgeoning growth in automobiles and engines, not steam engines, but internal combustion engines, and things like that, the same kinds of engines that are still in many cars today, starts to proliferate new inventions like airplanes. And we also see new inventions of the second industrial revolution, such as telephones, which come directly after telegraphs, and radio technology, and those kinds of things are really what we would characterize as being parts of the second industrial revolution. So, but we're like I say, for this unit, we're just focused on the very beginnings of industrialization. So you don't have to worry about those kinds of other things yet. Those will come down the line in about, another unit or two, somewhere in there. When we get to the late 1800s, we're still in the early 1800s. You know, another thing to mention to you about this period of time, I'm just going to quickly, in the early slides of this PowerPoint, just going to be recapping a little bit on, the path to industrialization. You might remember some of the things that I'm going to be talking about from the last unit that we had before we went away for winter break. And that was talking about proto-industrialization, the cottage industry, the agricultural revolution. And because those things are so closely connected to the Industrial Revolution, there's no way of really talking about the Industrial Revolution and the beginnings of the British growth of industry without talking about the influence that the agricultural revolution, as well as that period of time known as proto-industrialization, or the cottage industry, or the putting out system, had on the growth of industry in England. So, overview of the Industrial Revolution: machines began to replace significantly human and animal power in the production of the manufacturing of goods. The steam engine was used increasingly to produce textiles, and really the steam engine doesn't come about until the late 1700s, and the early designs of it are pretty simplistic, but as time goes on, they're going to continue going back and adding innovations and improvements to the steam engine to make them larger and more powerful and more efficient, and also put them in a number of new applications like trains and boats. As late as the 1830s, one of the things that we have to understand is that factories, which is one of the things that we most commonly associate with the Industrial Revolution, to be honest, factories as we know them today did not really emerge until until the 1830s. The Industrial Revolution isn't just something that happens overnight and magically everybody moves to the cities and starts working in wage labor jobs in factories. It takes quite some time for enough people to migrate away from those rural populations seeking out work in urban areas at factories and stuff like that. Europe gradually transitioned from this agricultural and commercial society into a modern industrial society. And by the mid-19th century, industrialization had spread all across Europe, some places more than others. Pretty much, if we think of a map of Europe, the path of industrialization, let me just pull up a map of Europe really quick. If we pull up a map of Europe, I'll just use Google Maps, what the heck. Close this, close this. Okay. As we take a look at a map of Europe here, here's England, obviously, okay? And the path of industry spreads away from here. So the places that are farthest to the east and farthest to the south are going to be the places in Europe that are going to be later to industrialize. The farther away you get from England, the longer it takes for industrialization to spread there. Conversely, the places that are closest to England, Belgium, the Dutch Republic, Germany, France, Denmark, etc., are going to industrialize faster. Also, because of the unique cultural similarities between England and the United States, America is going to industrialize right on the heels of Britain, right around the same time that they do. So basically, Britain first, then the first place in the continental Europe, okay? In other words, the continent, not the island of Britain, but the land continent of Europe. Belgium is the first place to industrialize after England on the continent, and it spreads very quickly away from Belgium into neighboring areas as well. So that gives you an idea of geographically how the Industrial Revolution spreads. The economic changes of the Industrial Revolution did more than any other movement to revolutionize life in Europe and Western civilization. Really not since the development of permanent agriculture during the Neolithic times back 10,000 years ago had there been such a radical change in society. So talking about the roots of the Industrial Revolution, how does it happen? Well, there are some long-term factors that led to it, and there are some more immediate short-term factors that led to the rise of the Industrial Revolution. But let's start off talking about some of the long-term factors. The commercial revolution that had taken place during the Age of Exploration spurred a huge amount of economic growth. Remember that during the 15, 16, and 1700s, many European nations, England included, had begun moving across the Atlantic and setting up new colonies in different places across the world. Some in North America, some in Central America and the Caribbean, some in South America, and then you even had some across both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And this ended up making it so that Europe was able to tap the resources of places that grew different kinds of things that weren't available in Europe. I mean, after all, if you tried to start a banana farm in England, you're going to have a pretty unsuccessful business because bananas don't grow in England. You can only get bananas from places that bananas grow. And so the fact that this age of exploration had made it so that Europe was able to have all of these different kinds of particularly new kinds of foodstuffs. It created this price revolution, which stimulated production, and it also stimulated the rise of early capitalism. Because even in the early days of the 15 and 1600s, you might remember me telling you about the Virginia Company, which was that joint stock company where wealthy gentry of England could invest their own personal wealth into the Virginia Joint Stock Company, which had been given a charter by the King of England to go and explore and permanently create a colony in North America. And because they were successful in doing so, of course, those who invested in the joint stock company made a whole lot of money. All right, and this is very similar to how modern day stocks work. Perhaps you've heard in the news recently about the Redditors who have been buying up stocks of businesses such as GameStop and AMC movie theaters, which are on the verge of bankruptcy. And the reason that they started doing that is because they realized that they could stick it to the hedge fund, massive financial companies in Wall Street who were betting that these companies would fail. And when the companies, thanks to a bunch of armchair, everyday people investing what little money they have into AMC and GameStop the last week, it caused a major surge in the valuation of those companies. And that led the stock market to go into chaos because a lot of these big companies that had a bunch of money betting on these businesses failing, once they started quote unquote doing better, which they're really not doing better, it's all kind of just a giant game that these people are playing. But these big, huge financial companies lost a ton of money, and then these companies, which are like Robinhood, is in some trouble right now because Robinhood, which had been this company that prided itself on giving people who don't have a ton of money the opportunity to trade, they interfered with the market and they stepped in and they said, no, you can't buy these shares because you're destroying hedge fund companies and they're more important than you. And this has created a lot of controversy. Now, of course, what I'm talking about right now is capitalism. Taking money, investing it in businesses, with the hope that you can yourself gain a bunch of money. All right, entrepreneurship, if you will. But this is, as much as entrepreneurship is a great feature of capitalism, one of the things that capitalism oftentimes results in is a very, 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 very small percentage of people at the top of the socioeconomic ladder who have unfathomably huge amounts of wealth. We're talking on the scale of billions of dollars. To name a few, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, Elon Musk, those kinds of folks, okay, who have just exorbitant amounts of wealth because their businesses have done very, very, very well. And then you have rather a pittance of wealth that is spread across the rest of the global population. Now, here in the United States, when we talk economics, we really have to think about it on two different scales. We think about economics on a domestic scale here at home in America, and we also can think about economics on a global scale. And here in America, we have a sizable amount of people who consider themselves part of the middle class. And very much on a global scale, they're absolutely right. I mean, even if you're born here, just the mere fact that you're born here in America, but in particular for your scenario, for you kids in this class here today, the fact that you're born in Southern California, which is one of the wealthiest places on the planet, And the fact that you live, many of you, maybe not all of you, but a good number of you probably live in very nice houses. You know, houses that are really large and have beautiful lawns and a whole bunch of fancy features like running water and electricity and heating and air conditioning, and you have comfortable beds to sleep in and all of these other things. You have to understand that these are just simply privileges that there's a whole lot of people in the world that don't have them. You know, and it's so easy when you're young and when you don't know anything else to take a look at your situation and pick apart what's not going right about it. But I have to tell you, the true fact of the matter is, to be honest with you, if you grew up, okay, if you grew up and you got a job that was paying, let's say, $65,000 a year, okay? Now, $65,000 a year is, to be completely honest with you, you know, not a ton of money. Okay, you're not gonna be keeping up with the Kardashians on a $65,000 a year income. All right, that's the truth of the matter. All right, but you got to look at who you're comparing yourself to. Okay, if you're comparing yourself to the 1% or less of people in the United States, okay, the top 10% of the 1%, okay, the richest of the rich, you're going to be miserable all the time, because the fact of the matter is you're probably never going to have that much money. Okay, if you're comparing yourself to the 2 billion people on Earth's surface who are living on less than $2 a day, okay, you're doing pretty well on $65,000 a year. In fact, I'd wager to estimate that globally, that if you were making $65,000 a year today in 2021, okay, that you would be not in the top 10%, not in the top 5%. You'd probably be in the top 2% of the entire global population in terms of wealth. And that's what you really need to think about. Here in the United States, a $50,000, $60,000, or $70,000 job career, you know, is not going to be able to afford you the mansion on the top of the hill in Malibu, I'm sorry to tell you, okay? But what it will afford you to be able to do is to live a relatively comfortable life in most places in America. Southern California, you'll struggle a little bit, okay? But you will be doing far better than the vast majority of people across the globe. So, you know, when we talk about capitalism, it's a tricky thing. There's a downside to it, which is that it puts, you know, the privilege of your life is built on the backs of a whole lot of people whose lives are absolutely miserable compared to yours. And frankly, you know, the other side of it being that no matter how hard those people work, you could be the hardest working, most motivated person on the planet living in the slums of Dharavi, India, outside of Mumbai, and you will never, ever, ever enter into the echelon of the quality of life that you have growing up in Eastvale, going to a beautiful school. I know that we're doing the distance instruction right now, but you go to a beautiful STEM academy with all of the nicest facilities in the nation, okay, of any school in the country, really. I mean, there's a whole lot to look around at your lives and just be super, super grateful for. And I always try and mention that when I talk about the Industrial Revolution, because it's easy for us to take a look at capitalism and trash it, okay? Because there's a lot of people who suffer as a result of global capitalism. And I think that globally, as a people, we should try and come together and solve some of these problems, because capitalism has dire effects on the environment. Capitalism has dire effects on people's quality of life. Capitalism has dire effects on people deriving meaning from their life. And there's a lot of people who look at capitalism as the end game of, well, if I just made $1 million billion and could buy everything that I wanted and had a garage full of Ferraris and Lamborghinis and I lived in this massive house and da-da-da-da-da, I'd be happy. Never, ever, 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 ever let yourself fall for that line of garbage, okay? No matter how much money you have, no matter how many wonderful material goods you have in your life, okay, it will never fill you up. I just want to put that out there right now. Little life existentialism lesson for you. Never, ever, ever, never, ever, ever let being super, super rich, okay, be the thing that you think will bring you happiness. I can tell you from my own life experiences, because I'm quite a bit older than you kids are. All right, I'm 37. Okay, I've taken quite a few more trips around the sun than you have, and I didn't grow up in a place as nice as Eastvale. I grew up in a suburb of North Minneapolis. Okay, my mom still lives in the house that I grew up in. We were not wealthy. Okay, I always thought, you know what, if I had more money, if I could buy this, you know, this, that, I'd be happy. I'm at a point now in my life where I'm certainly not rich, but I've worked hard to make enough money to be able to support myself. But the fact of the matter is that capitalism serves one end, okay, and that is to make consumer goods readily available to people. And I appreciate those things that I have here at my house. I appreciate the comfortability of my life, but I don't let those things, you know, fancy cars, fancy this, fancy that, dictate my happiness. There's a whole lot of things that I derive happiness from that don't cost a single solitary penny. And I hope that you identify those things in your life and let those things be the things that bring you meaning. Okay, I'll step off of my old man podium here and we'll continue talking about the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so the scientific revolution produced the first wave of mechanical inventions, right? Going back to the 15, 16, 1700s. This is another long-term cause of industrialization. And then, you know, Europe's increased population provided larger markets because not only do you have more people to work in different capacities in factories and things, you also have more people who want to buy things. So population growth has been another major factor in what has sustained the growth of industrialization over time. We rely on population growth so that businesses can continue to grow and people will continue to buy goods that they need. All right, proto-industrialization, we talked about this too. I'm going to move through this part quickly. Proto-industrialization was that thing we learned about back at the end of last semester about the putting out system, where those urban merchants would circumvent the guild system in urban areas in England and put orders of spinning wool into yarn out to the surrounding countryside. And they would have particularly women who were looking to supplement their income through doing more work. They would have women in these surrounding cottage areas spin all of this wool into thread and sometimes even weave it into fabric and other things like that. This was called the proto-industrialization period because it's kind of a mock-up design of what industrialization would eventually look like down the line. What do I mean by that? Well, in proto-industry, think of it this way. It's almost like a factory in reverse, okay? Instead of having a central location where workers come and congregate during the day, work, and then leave at night and go home, the way that it worked is that the factory materials would be sent out to the workers who lived in the surrounding countryside. They would make it in their own homes, and then they would transport those finished products back to the merchant capitalists, who would then sell them for more money than it cost to produce them so that they would earn their profit on the tail end of it. And so this allows for the growth of the textile industry in England even before factories are really used widely. But the reason that they switched it, of course, okay, is because there were a number of problems with cottage industry. Okay, you had a number of disputes between cottagers and those local urban merchants over the weights of their materials, the quality of the cloth that was produced, how fast they're producing it, things like that. Rural labor proved to be very unorganized, disorganized, and difficult to control. And so, of course, factories are a prudent solution to this, because with factories, you gain the thing that you didn't have before, which is supervision. Okay, you can supervise people who show up at your factory. If they show up drunk, you can fire them. If they cut their hand off, you can fire them. If they're not working hard enough, you can fire them. If they're not good at what they're doing, you can fire them. And there's so many people that are searching out jobs at this time that whenever a person was fired, there was 10 people in line ready to take their place. Okay, so the cottage industry gives way ultimately to the factory system. So cottage industry flourished in England. You might remember some of the early kinds of inventions that were associated with the early textile development, such as John Kay's flying shuttle, or James Hargreaves' spinning jenny, or even Richard Arkwright's water frame. And each of these inventions, including the water frame, of course, continued to go through new innovation, new redesigns, and they would increase the size and efficiency of these machines, which eventually, of course, started to fill up these factories and produce, in mass, huge quantities of textiles at a rate much faster than could ever have been done during the cottage industry. Okay, so why does England industrialize first? Well, they had what's known as, and I do want you to commit this to memory, they had all of what were known as the factors of production. The factors of production. What are the factors of production? All right, they are, and you do need to remember this, the three factors of production are land, labor, and capital. Okay, land, labor, and capital. These are the three factors of production. However, beyond that, beyond knowing what the factors of production are, which you can just consider broadly to be prerequisites to industrialization, you need to have them before a nation can industrialize. If you don't have certain land assets, certain labor assets, and certain capital assets, your nation is never going, it's going to be a plane without wings. It's never going to take off. Okay? So, beyond land, labor, and capital, we need to further understand more about how England's land, how England's labor, and how England's capital were used to industrialize. So let's spend a little bit of time on this slide just talking a little bit about beginning with land factors. So in terms of land factors, how does England take advantage of their land factors in the process of industrialization? Well, I would like to draw your attention to this map over here. Okay, you will notice that on this map, now if you don't know the topography of England, England is relatively flat. Okay, there's a lot of lowlands in England. It's pretty marshy and swampy in some areas, but it's not mountainous. And that's really important for England. The fact that they're not mountainous, the fact that they had a bunch of lowlands, which also creates rivers, as you'll see here, a number of rivers that penetrate well throughout the entire country of England. Okay, they used their rivers, they used the flat land to their advantage, because the flat land, first of all, provided outlets for farming during the agricultural revolution, but then beyond that, as we move into the industrial revolution, the fact that England is flat made it easier for them to connect places together on land via railroads and so on. By comparison, if you take Japan, Japan is an island nation just like England is. But unlike England, Japan is extremely mountainous, which meant that when Japan started building railroads, they had a lot of natural barriers that made the task a lot more difficult. Now, to the credit of the Japanese, they actually did it with astonishingly fast speed, but nonetheless, it made it much more difficult. Another major land factor that England had, which is really just by way of luck and nothing more, was the fact that they had a whole bunch of mines that were filled with raw materials such as iron ore and coal, which they increasingly began mining during the Industrial Revolution. In particular, the coal was used as fuel, as I mentioned earlier, because they had chopped down all the trees in England and there were basically none left. Okay, so this gives you some idea of some of the land factors. Another major land factor is merely the fact that if you take a look at England here, it's an island. And I wanted to draw your attention, I was going to mention this earlier and I forgot to. I want to mention to you that as the Industrial Revolution is happening, you have to understand it's happening at the same time that the French Revolution is happening just across the English Channel. And the same time that Napoleon is waging his conquest of Europe. So England, on top of doing all of this industrialization that they're doing at this time, they are fighting wars against France. And that's yet another amazing thing, and it's a land advantage. And the reason it's a land advantage is because, remember, after the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, which was the one that saw Horatio Nelson, the Vice Admiral of the British Navy, shot by a French sniper, nonetheless, the British came out victorious against the French Navy in that battle. And after 1805, Napoleon would never be able to use the French Navy to get across the channel to England to do a land invasion. So England being an island served itself as a major advantage to England because it had the water around it served as a natural barrier to Napoleon's conquest right at the exact same time that England is beginning to industrialize. So that covers a number of the different land advantages that England had in terms of their factors of production. Let's move on and start talking about some of the population factors, the labor factors, okay? So, as you know, during the agricultural revolution and increasingly throughout the 1700s into the era of proto-industrialization and the putting out system, England had been undergoing tremendous population growth. Meanwhile, thanks to the new inventions like we just looked at, the spinning jenny, the water frame, as well as other things like the seed drill by Jethro Tull that we learned about during the agricultural revolution and things like that, and new drainage methods and all of these other things. England's farmers are now using better tools, bigger tools, machinery eventually, using steam engines and things like that by the time we get into the 1800s. And what this meant was that the farms, number one, became more productive. They're producing more food than they ever had before. Number two is that they have less people working the machines because the machines cut down on the need for human labor. And so as a result of that, okay, you have fewer people who are able to find work in rural areas, agricultural areas. Meanwhile, thanks to one of the things that I talked to you about before, which was the enclosure movement, large landowners were buying up smaller pieces of land that were nearby the large piece of land that they already held. And then they would build those enclosures like hedges and fences around those lands and be removing the peasants from those lands. They got rid of peasant common areas, for example. They cracked down on peasant hunting rights by passing the game laws and other stuff like that. These peasants, to be completely frank with you, did not want to leave, okay? They didn't want to, think about it. These are peasants, okay? They work and live on farms. Their parents lived and worked on farms. Their grandparents lived and worked on farms. Their great-grandparents lived and worked on farms, etc. Okay, they don't want to see the only life that they know be the rug that's ripped out from right underneath their feet. So when these changes are happening, It's not that they really want this to happen because it's scary to them. They're being removed from their lands, they have no jobs, and they're struggling. For those people who wanted to be able to continue that style of life of farming, those who had enough money or who were able to maybe sell their small plot of land for enough money to afford to be able to migrate to another place, they would move to America and buy land there, which was much more readily available and far cheaper. And they would establish farms and so on in the New World. Okay, that was if you had the money to afford it. And indeed, of course, we saw a lot of people from England in the 1810s, 20s, 30s migrating over to America to continue the same kind of farming life that they lived in northern England. However, the vast majority of people in England were poor workers, poor farmers, and they didn't have the money necessary to be able to migrate across the ocean and start up a new life in a completely different place. And that meant that the opportunities that were afforded to them were ones that were less desirable, such as migrating to an urban area in England, a city, and then taking up a job as a wage laborer in, for example, a factory. And as the population in England, number one, continues to grow, but number two, there's less opportunities available for them in rural farming situations, these people need to survive, okay? And they get desperate. And it's funny because when we talk about wage labor today, if I told you, hey, you could go and get a job where somebody will pay you for your time, you're going to be like, heck yeah, sign me up. I'd love to have a job where people pay me to go and show up and work and do different things, right? We thrive on wage labor today, okay? But the fact of the matter is that in these times, wage labor was seen as essentially barely one rung on the ladder above slavery. Okay, people didn't want to perform wage labor because they knew what wage labor was like. It's hard, it's long hours, it's terrible working conditions, it is terrible for your health, it is claustrophobic because you're living in a dirty, overcrowded city that wasn't designed to handle the amount of people that are moving to it. It is miserable living and working conditions. It's a terrible life to go and get a job as a wage laborer at this time. Not to mention the wages, you're not going to be making, tons and tons of money. You're going to be making just barely enough to cover your living expenses, food, renting whatever tiny little tenement house that you're living in. They had these things called tenement apartments that people would live in, which were basically made out of wood and paper and cardboard products. They were, giant death traps, okay? They could have set fire at any time, exploded, you name it, okay? People are burning open fires in their living rooms. It's everything is a complete danger, okay? And so, but the labor source was so plentiful that this is ultimately what allowed them to industrialize. Without the labor source of people moving away from these farmlands into urban areas, not because they want to, but because they have to, this meant that England had a massive advantage to get people working in these massive industrial businesses, enterprises that started to develop. And that extended outside of factories into other things too, digging ditches, laying railroad tracks, mining coal or iron, and various other things as well. Okay, so that covers the labor side of land, labor, and capital. Okay, land, labor, and capital. Let's talk about the capital factors. And to do that, I'm actually going to move on to the next slide here and give you this little acronym that hopefully will help you remember, some of the advantages as to why the Industrial Revolution happened in England. You might say it happened because of magic. Okay, now it's not really magic, obviously. We're just using this as a way to remember some of these terms here that could help you remember some of the land, labor, and capital factors as to why England was able to industrialize before anywhere else. So, M, markets abroad, and 2, you could also say maritime strength for this one. When we talk about markets abroad, I'm referring to what I was mentioning a minute ago about how various European nations, Britain included, had these colonies across the globe. And the reason that the colonies were so invaluable to the British and the other European nations was because they were able to extract resources from these colonies that you could not get anywhere in Europe. That originally it was food products, spices, and other things like that. But eventually it's going to be other stuff, okay, not just food products, but it'll be, it'll be down the line things like diamonds, gold, precious stones, precious wood types, and various other things like that. And so the English were using their many, many, many different colonies to extract raw materials to build into finished products. And then on the other hand, what they would do is not only would they extract raw materials from these places and bring them back to England and then manufacture them into finished goods, they would then take those finished goods and bring them back to their colonies and sell them to the people in the colonies. So it's not even just the fact that England's own population was growing and providing a vast source of people to work and produce goods. They were also a vast source of people to purchase the goods. Okay, making all of that stuff doesn't do anyone any good unless you have people out there who can also buy those same things. Okay, and so that is a huge advantage to them. Also, before I forget, because I want to make sure that I mention this, we talked a little bit earlier in class today about how even in modern day capitalism, there's a lot of people who suffer and struggle through their lives to make your life better, basically. Okay, think about, the nameless, let me show you something here. Think about this for a second. In my house, I have all sorts of different crazy stuff, okay? But pretty much every single thing that probably both you and I have in our houses are from industrial goods, right? Take, for example, this little remote control, okay? I'm sitting in front of my monitor here and it has a little remote that comes with it. Just this little part right here, this little battery door, okay, on the remote control. There's some nameless factory somewhere on Earth's surface where these little parts, okay, just this little part right here, is being produced all day, every day, and there's some person working at that factory who makes this part, or probably many of them at a time, and then when the plastic machine gets done pressing the plastic, they take the part, they throw it in the box, and they do it again. And the reason I know about this is because I used to work at a plastics factory, where I made very similar parts to this one. Every so often, sometimes I'll just stop and look around at the amazing amount of stuff that is just produced by factories all over the globe. I have this little coffee mug here. Just this individual plastic part that comes off at the top here. I'm not going to take it off right now because I don't want to break it. But just this one little plastic part. There's some place that just produces this. Just this thing. And then there's another place that probably produces this clear plastic part. And then there's some other factory somewhere else that produces this thing. Right? Everything in your house essentially is a manufactured good that you purchase. And it's cheap and it's readily available to you. The thing that I want to make sure that I mention, getting back to the PowerPoint here though, is that at this time, it's very much done on particularly the textile industry, comes very much on the backs of American slaves, African Americans. Okay, one of the things that a lot of students may not know about is that when we broke away from England and we, eventually wrote the Constitution, by the time that the American Revolutionary War was over and the founding fathers were setting up the blueprint for the American government, many of those founding fathers had, even though they were themselves slaveholders, including George Washington, including Thomas Jefferson, and these types of people, many of these founding fathers who even owned slaves had reservations about the institution of slavery in America. And there was a lot of indications throughout the 1770s and 1780s that slavery was dying out in America. It wasn't until the invention of a guy by the name of Eli Whitney called the cotton gin. The cotton gin, poor Eli Whitney could never have probably predicted that the result of this would be what it was. But the cotton gin single-handedly reinvigorated slavery in the United States. All right. Slavery was dying out. More and more slaves were being emancipated, particularly in the North. They were being set free. Plantation farming in America had declined a bit, and the reason for it is because the number one fabric that textiles were made out of prior to Eli Whitney's cotton gin was wool. And sheep, aside from feeding sheep and raising the sheep and stuff like that, it doesn't take a ton of people to handle a sheep farm. Cotton, comparative to wool, cotton is a plant and it grows in the ground. Much the same way that sugar, which is the number one plantation crop that was grown during the slave trade days, is grown as well. And as you know about sugar, the same with cotton, it's extremely labor intensive. It takes a lot of people to grow cotton, and it takes a lot of people to make cotton into a viable material to be able to produce textiles or cloth out of it. Why is that? Well, just to show you what I mean, there's two kinds of cotton. There's long stalk cotton and there's short stalk cotton or short fiber cotton. And I just wanted to take a minute here to show you what cotton looks like when it grows out of the ground. Let me see if I can find a really good picture for you. Let's click on this one. Let's see if I can find, here we go. All right. Ooh, actually I like this one. Let's do this one right here. Okay, so this is, even though I know that this says, what is it, Egyptian long staple cotton, this is actually short staple cotton right here. Okay, short staple cotton grows close to the ground, not very tall, and it grows in these little pods, these little sharp pods right here. And this is not like a soft flower petal. These are rigid and they are spiky and they're super sharp. It would take you kids in this class, who probably very few of you have ever performed manual labor before, it would take you about 5 minutes for your fingers to be torn to complete shreds picking cotton out of this short staple cotton here. Okay? Not to mention, it's not like you just pull these little cotton fluffies off of it and magically you have cotton. No, inside of these cotton pods, okay, you have seeds and you have shards of the broken off pod material inside the cotton fiber. And you have to clean out this cotton here, okay? And this was the part that was super labor intensive, because to pick the seeds out of the cotton and clean the cotton into fabric so that you could weave it into cotton thread was extremely labor intensive and time consuming. Okay, when the cotton gin gets invented, it cuts the time of cleaning the cotton down by like 95%. Okay, so this one little simple invention makes cotton a viable crop. Prior to that, cotton was so labor intensive, you'd spend more making a cotton shirt than you'd be able to sell it for. So it was completely upside down. There was no profitability in growing cotton because it was so limited. As the cotton gin gets invented, cotton becomes the number one plantation crop in the United States. And slavery in the United States expands dramatically from when it was invented in 1793-ish all the way up until the start of the Civil War in 1860. So for decades, slavery is growing in America during this time. And by the way, Americans are trading slaves, okay, between the North and the South in what becomes known as the domestic slave trade of the United States throughout that entire period of time as well. Okay, and I just feel like it's super important to remember this because, you know, at all points in the history of capitalism, it was built on a class of subjugated workers, and in this case, workers who were not even considered to be people, but rather workers that were considered to be property. And you can imagine the long-term effects that has had on the development of American society, right? So that's why I wanted to mention that to you. But enough on that. Let's get back to this. Agricultural revolution. Remember that England had that larger population from increased food supply, which meant that people's diets were better, which meant that people were living longer and having more kids and stuff like that. Relocation of that population to urban centers after the enclosure movement, I mentioned that to you already as well. So A, agricultural revolution. G, government protects private property and entrepreneurs. So the government of England at this time is run by Parliament. We're in the 1800s, okay? Parliament has long been kind of the top dog in terms of the day-to-day governmental decisions that are being made. Parliament is made up of both the House of Lords and the House of Commons, but both houses of Parliament are made up of relatively well-to-do, upper-middle class, bourgeoisie, noble, gentry type folks. And because they're the ones that are serving in government, obviously it stands to reason that the kinds of laws and policy decisions that they'll be making will be ones that directly benefit themselves, because they're the ones that are making the laws. Now, if this sounds corrupt to you, it's because it is. The government should be making laws that benefit all of society, not just the group of people serving in government who are already really wealthy and well-to-do. However, because these guys came from this relatively new class of liberal bourgeois people, okay, who were believers in capitalism, who were believers in the industrial growth that England could manifest, they started making laws that encouraged the growth of industry and the growth of of factories and of entrepreneurship and things like that. Think of it almost like if you've ever seen the show Shark Tank, okay, with Mark Cuban and the other sharks, okay? What happens on that show is people who have good ideas, new inventions or new products or services that they're trying to make a business out of, they will go on Shark Tank and pitch their idea to the sharks, who are the entrepreneurs. And these sharks have a whole lot of money. They're all like billionaires. So they listen to these people's ideas, and they read over some of their numbers. How long have they been in business? How profitable has their business been? Et cetera, et cetera. They ask them some questions, and then based on that, the sharks will make a determination of either one, trying to make a deal with them, or saying, you know, for that reason, I'm out. Okay, that's Mark Cuban's favorite line. And for that reason, I'm out. But anyhow, what are they doing? These wealthy entrepreneurs on Shark Tank are taking their own personal wealth and they are investing it into these people who come on the show, and and these people will use that wealth then to pay for whatever costs they need. Marketing costs, labor costs, manufacturing costs, you name it, okay? And the reason that the sharks are doing this is not out of the kindness of their heart. They're not just saying, here, have $1 million and good luck to you. No, they make a deal with them, usually for a stake in their business. So usually, like when the shark offers, or the entrepreneur offers the startup business a certain amount of money, it's in exchange for part ownership of their business. And the reason for that is because if that business is successful, the shark will also make money on the tail end of it by making a boatload of money on the sales of this business that they helped to grow. And the government of England at this time is passing laws that encourage that kind of economic behavior to happen. Iron and coal deposits. We talked about that on the last slide. Remember that iron and coal were essential to the first industrial revolution in building all sorts of different things, including building materials, but also machines and other stuff like that. And then capital. So capital, frankly, is just a fancy word for money. And as people started to take jobs where they were making money through wage labor, they started to have money left over that they would then be able to use to purchase whatever goods they need. And this is really the hallmark indicator of the Industrial Revolution. Because what we have done here, when people start to have extra money in their wallet to be able to go out and purchase things, we see a transition away from how the economy used to be before, which was much more largely based on production. Imagine living in your house and needing a new pair of shoes, and your only way of getting a new pair of shoes would be literally to make your own pair of shoes. Okay, that's going to be a lot of labor. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to take you a long time. One of the benefits of capitalism is that we no longer rely on producing those kinds of things, growing our own food to eat, you know, and that kind of deal. Okay, if we get hungry, we can just order food. Okay, we can even have food delivered to our house now through DoorDash and stuff like that. Okay, we can go on Amazon and buy ourselves a new alarm clock or a new phone or a new pair of shoes or a new shirt or a new bike or whatever we want. Okay, once you have money, you stop making the things that you need and you start purchasing the things that you need. This is called a consumer-based economy. No longer are you producing things, you are now consuming things. And it's hard even to imagine what the world was like just 220 years ago when that really was not a thing. Okay? There was no such thing as being able to just show up at a random department store where you had a whole bunch of different types of goods being sold there, from furniture to clothing to kitchen utensils to whatever. Okay? If you wanted any of that stuff, you had to make it yourself, and most people didn't have the means to do that. And so most people prior to the Industrial Revolution really lived very Spartan lives, very simple, very, very plain, undecorated. Okay? It's not until people start realizing, oh, well, if I want some silverware, I can just save up some money and buy some. You know, that doesn't start happening until after the Industrial Revolution gets underway. And in the documentary, they'll talk to you about that as well. But these people are, you know, people who have a lot of money, you know, the bourgeoisie and the middle class, who are still only maybe about 10 to 15% of the total population, so not a majority, but enough where people were willing to start putting their money into businesses, making risky investments on businesses like railroad companies or steam engine companies or textile companies or you name it, that allows those people to gain money from those companies growing the very same way that people who have money today invested in retirement plans, which are invested into stocks like Amazon or Microsoft or Apple or you name it, companies that are big and growing, Amazon, you name it, okay, that will ultimately grow your own wealth. Okay, and so people have more money as a result of investing their money in businesses that grow to be absolutely enormous. Okay, so England was the first country to industrialize. It began in the 1780s, but really doesn't finish really its completion to full scale factory production until about 1830. And because of the wars going on in continental Europe in the early part of the 1800s with Napoleon, really this growth of industry doesn't have a whole lot of effect on the continent until after the Napoleonic Wars come to an end. I mentioned to you about the geographic isolation from the continent, offering Britain protection. I mentioned their waterways, I mentioned their coal and iron. And the Industrial Revolution grew out of England's expanding role in the Atlantic economy of the 1700s, the 18th century, where they had won the 7 Years' War and they had begun to dominate trade on the Atlantic and in the Caribbean. And they were trading with America for cotton being grown by the African American slaves. And so the Industrial Revolution was the Agricultural Revolution played a major part in this too, because of the supply of cheap and abundant labor emerging and moving to those towns and cities and taking jobs in factories, as well as the revolution in agriculture making it possible for fewer farmers to feed larger numbers of people as those farms became more efficient and produced more and more and more food with fewer and fewer and fewer people working on the farms. More people were freed up to work in factories or in the distribution of other goods and services, and so people started moving around in search of land or employment, particularly to urban areas. You also had large supplies of capital that were available due to over 2 centuries of profitable commercial activity trading on the Atlantic. England, during this time, even though they had waged a number of wars against the French, had avoided a number of other ones. And they had emerged victorious in a number of the ones that they were involved in. So during that time, British merchants and gentry had prospered significantly during these wars on the continent, because whenever you win a war, you get the spoils of war and you make money off of it. The government had already established that Bank of England going all the way back to 1694, which gave England a nice stable currency, a nice stable bank to be able to finance loans and take out debt against the government and pay that debt back through taxes and stuff like that. And we also saw the emergence of insurance companies during this time. Just to finish out the PowerPoint lecture for today, these new inventions led to a lot of success. Thanks to these entrepreneurs who were willing to invest their money into businesses, these people were willing to take on the risks of running a business by investing money into it, and that's exactly how James Watt goes about creating the improved steam engine. Now remember, the steam engine had already existed beforehand, but Watt believed he could redesign it and make a better, more efficient one. And that's exactly what he did, but he could only do that because of the help of an entrepreneur who was willing to take a risky investment in James Watt, just like the sharks on Shark Tank, and say, I think you have a good idea, I'm going to invest in your idea, and I want a stake of the profits that you get when your business grows. And indeed, they both became extraordinarily wealthy. Watt's steam engine completely changed the face of the Industrial Revolution because, of course, the steam engine had so many different applications, from water pumps in coal mines to the engines that are running locomotives, to the engines that are running boats and factories and farm equipment and you name it. So the steam engine really, as the Industrial Revolution progresses, further advances and speeds up the growth of the Industrial Revolution itself. So that brings me to the end of today's PowerPoint. I hope you all found today's lecture to be super informative, and we will see you back on Friday. Don't forget to do those reading guide questions, and have a wonderful rest of your day.